revered and loved by millions across the UK, the Commonwealth, and the world. The curtain came down on the reign of the longest reigning monarch in British history on the 8th of September 2022. It hardly seems possible that it's a year since Elizabeth II died. And in this special episode, history writer Gareth Streeter is joining me, royal commentator James Taylor, to reflect on her life and reign. Hi, Gareth. How are you feeling?
I am very good, James. Like you, I can't quite believe it's been a year since that big day. But I'm looking forward to having the opportunity to discussing it with you and hopefully giving people the opportunity to reflect with us back on that momentous event and the year that has followed it. How are you?
I'm okay. And yeah, it feels very strange to be looking back over that. I think that it was quite a surreal time, really. And it's only when you look back that you're able to appreciate just what was happening and what a unique moment it was in our lives. Because, you know, you and I are both of an age where we'd never seen the death of a monarch. We'd never seen any of the ceremonies. We'd read about them, we knew about them, but we'd never actually witnessed them before. And I think that it's only in retrospect that you're able to realize just how momentous all of that was.
And I mean, not just us. My parents, for example, who
Mm.
let's just say they're not young, they'd never seen it either.
Mm.
So it makes you realize really not that many people had seen it before, and probably most of those that had were probably too young to really remember it anyway.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, my parents are no longer with us, but my dad was 13 in 1952 at the
Right.
time that George VI died. And I always remember him telling me how he remembered because he was, you know, it was announced at 11:30 that the king had died in his sleep,
Mm.
and so he remembered being at school and being taken into a special assembly where they announced that the king had died. And I always remembered him telling me that just because, again, as I say, it was something that we'd never witnessed. And so I remember asking him lots of details. And of course, as the 13-year-old, he probably wouldn't have taken that much
Mm.
notice other
Mm.
than it was happening. But because I was, you know, that sort of royal history geeky child,
Mm.
I was, you know, wanting to know all the intricate details. And he just wasn't able to tell me, to be quite
Mm.
honest.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
But going back to the events of a year ago, um, I think that it's one of those things that for our generation, it's that same thing of where you were, you'd remember where you were in the same way
Yes.
that you'd remember where you were at the time of the abdication, at the time that war was declared, when President Kennedy was shot, all of those. And so I think that for our generation, it will be where we were when we heard the Queen had died.
Absolutely. So where were you?
Well, it's ironic, really, because I'd been at home during the day and I'd heard the Queen was unwell and was under medical supervision. So I've been watching the coverage all throughout the afternoon. But then I was supposed to be going out that evening and I was supposed to be picking someone up. And I thought, should I go? Should I not? And I thought, well, there's nothing I can do sat at home. So I may as well go. But no sooner had I got into my car and got no further than the end of the road, really, I heard then the announcement on BBC Radio. And so I went into my friend's house and I said, look, I'm really sorry, we can't go because I'm going to have to go back because the Queen has died. And she
Mm.
was very
Mm.
upset anyway, and I don't think she'd have wanted to go. But I knew that I would be very busy with requests and things. So I knew that I had to get back. But
Mm.
I just it was such a strange thing because knowing that the Queen had been ill and in declining health, knowing her age, you know, it was not a surprise, but yet it was still a shock. And I think it was
Mm.
that thing because no matter how much you are expecting it, when it happens, it
Mm.
still somehow seems unreal.
Mm. Mm. Well, she'd only been, I mean, was it the day before or 2 days before where she'd appointed Liz Truss Prime Minister? And that
It
was,
was
of course,
two,
that picture.
yes, it was 2 days before when she had received Liz Truss at Balmoral, and of course the pictures that you were talking about. That although she had her walking stick and she looked frail, she was still made up. She was still
Yeah,
smiling. You know, she while she looked frail, I would not have looked at those pictures, and indeed didn't look at those pictures and think,
mm,
oh, there's something imminent. I
I
think
agree.
the clue was that it had been originally, she had been expected to travel back to Buckingham
Yes.
Palace,
Yes.
and that there was an announcement that for certainty in the outgoing and incoming prime minister's diaries that they were going to be received at Balmoral rather than in London. So I think that was a clue.
I think that was
Even so,
quite a big clue because
but even yes, but
but
even so, I still think that you wouldn't have looked at those pictures and think, oh, she looks so terribly ill that within a
I,
couple of days
I,
she would.
I agree. And actually, even though I say it was a big clue, and I do think it was a significant moment, but actually, when someone is that age, my gran was a very similar age to the Queen and died earlier this year, but there's normally quite a long period of they can't be moved at the moment. Things have, actually wouldn't be quite a good idea. They can't make that. They can't go to that without death being literally the next day. There's that phase of someone's life often goes on for a couple of years. Now, to an extent, it had been to the Queen for some time. But yes, I do think the Balmoral thing, I did at the time remember thinking that's significant because I don't remember another occasion, and by all means, it may be that a listener can correct me on this, where Elizabeth II has ever appointed a prime minister in any location other than Buckingham Palace.
No, you're correct. No, she
Uh,
hadn't.
so obviously Victoria had, but that was very different. And
Well,
what
Victoria didn't go to Buckingham Palace, and also
yes,
she would not allow anything to interrupt with her plans for, if she was going to be in Osborne House, she was going to be at Balmoral, whatever, she wouldn't easily change her plans to go to,
yes,
well, after Prince Albert, she didn't live in Buckingham Palace, but to go to Windsor, for example, she wouldn't change her plans just because there was going to be a change of prime minister. Whereas with Elizabeth II, one got the impression that she would have done, although it would have been rare for that to happen sort of without warning.
I've seen her get helicoptered in from. I seen it on the TV. I wasn't there, from Windsor to Buckingham Palace to receive the Prime Minister, but I think that was for the dissolution of Parliament, the calling of a general election.
Yes.
But I think but with the Balmoral appointment of the Prime Minister, obviously the date was known for some time because everybody knew when the date of the Conservative Party leadership election result was going to be. The palace would have known that for some time, and therefore the appointment of the Prime Minister would be the next day. So the fact that they obviously at one stage thought that they had the agility to get Her Majesty back to Buckingham Palace in time for that, and then realised quite late that they weren't going to, it probably is significant. Well, it clearly was. We know that now.
Indeed. But I just think that, as I say, it was one of those things that no matter how much you've been expecting it, it was still something that was really momentous. And I remember my friend John sent me a message actually and said, are you all right? Because he said, because you've been interested in the royal family and the Queen in particular for so many years, I know you're going to be very busy. And indeed, I was getting a lot of requests for interviews on the radio and things like that. But also, he said, I hope you managed to find some time to be able to reflect on how you think about it. And that was something I think that was very sweet and something that I wouldn't necessarily have thought of, because I generally don't think about things like that unless it's a member of your family or somebody that you, or close friend or something. So I just thought that for somebody to have had that thought was actually was very kind and very insightful.
But it was a moment actually where you wanted to, not in a voyeuristic way, I hope not in a voyeuristic way anyway, but to just take stock and think, okay, this is a very significant moment. How do I feel about this? Not how, I don't mean how do I feel in terms of what's my truth about this situation, but how am I going to mark this? How am I going to remember this? How am I going to organize my thoughts to deal appropriately with the grandeur of this moment?
Indeed, and I think that for people like you and me who have always been interested in the royal family and had a real sense of affection for her as an individual, you wanted to get it right. You didn't want to be that that person that says the wrong or the inappropriate thing. and you also didn't want to, you know, and it is so. For example, I knew several people were saying, "Oh, I want to go," and it said in advance, "When she dies, I want to go and stand outside Buckingham Palace." And I sort of think, well, even if she were there, which she wasn't,
Mm.
there'd be nothing to see, and that's why I didn't do that. Although I did go a couple of days afterwards for the proclamation, but that's because I wanted to see the proclamation and hear the proclamation
Yes.
ceremony. And so that was again rather different because there was a reason for being there. But one thing that really did strike me was, you know, looking in the royal parks and in Green Park in particular, were all the floral tributes that had been left, and
Mm.
particularly there were an awful lot from children, and
Mm.
so cards with
Mm.
handprints on and things saying, you know, Queen and I love you and I miss
Mm.
you and all of those things, and the number of people that had left, you know, after the sketch and the Jubilee,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
the Paddington Bear you know, teddies, and also left jars of marmalade.
Mm.
And I wished that I'd taken one with me because I do make my own marmalade every year,
Mm.
and so I wished I'd taken a jar and left it. Although having said that, it would have been a silly thing to do because they weren't actually allowed to accept them; they would have been disposed of. But yeah, the number, and I did think that was very sweet. I did think that there was an awful lot of genuine affection
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. I agree. I think, and the only reason I'm being hesitant, I completely agree about there being genuine affection. I had with the Paddington, um, with the Paddington episode, and I was at Party in the Palace during the Jubilee, and so I was there when that was broadcast for the first time,
Yeah.
and it
So
was very.
there was I, but I didn't know you then, so I didn't see you.
Oh
But
no! Oh, I didn't see you, and I I was quite emotional about that. I thought that was a very when he, you know, his thank you, mum, for everything. I thought that was quite wonderful, and I think it's brilliant that she did it. And the
I
only
know this will sound very corny, but I remember thinking at the time, that's just what I'd say if I could say that to her.
Well, quite, and I think that's the point. You know, if you're going to have someone speaking, the Queen's normally the person that sort of embodies the nation. So if the nation wants to say something to the Queen, and you need another figure to embody the nation, Paddington's a pretty good one. But I think where I had a moment when I was reflecting on the way people were commemorating the death, with the amount of Paddington centricness of it, I was slightly a part of me thought, hang on a minute, this wonderful woman reigned for 70 years. She did remarkable things and acts of service. Her reign wasn't about one moment with Paddington toward the end. That said, I think that's probably me being ungenerous. And I think what the Paddington connection was able to do was to it was a way for families to involve children very much in the
Yes,
moment, and
yes.
probably to let children lead a degree of it and express their own feelings in a way that was relatable to them, and that's very
It was
important.
genuine to them. But the thing I would also say is bear in mind the historical context, because the Jubilee had been only, what, 3 months earlier.
Mm.
And so I think had it been longer than that, then people may have, you know, the Paddington effect might have worn off a bit. But I think because it was such a novelty at the time, and because it
Yes.
was so well received, it was so recent and so clear in people's memories that I think that that's why they associated with it. Although having said that, yes, I do get your point, and I do kind of agree that after so many years of service to her country and to the Commonwealth, that's how she's remembered. But having said that, you know, she seemed perfectly willing to take part in that, and was more, you know,
Absolutely.
and her comic timing was marvelous, and so
Yeah.
you know, she could have been an actress, couldn't she? And so I think that, well, perhaps she was to a degree to have to
Mm.
act on the world stage in the way she did, but I think that partly accounts for it. I think it is partly the, you know, the sense of it was only a couple of months before, and so therefore it was so fresh in everyone's minds. um
It is, and I guess that's sort of what I mean is there was a lot of attention to what's just happened
yeah,
rather than what.
rather than the broader historical context
Yeah,
of her
and to be
reign.
fair, of course, there are other opportunities, and we had, you know, some good shows were on in terms of, you know, documentaries of the Queen's life, and obviously the coronation. Sorry, not the coronation, the funeral. You know,
Yes.
drew a lot of attention to that too. So I'm not. I'm just sharing a slight bemusement I had rather than being critical of it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. And of course, one of the real highlights for me, although it was an extremely sad one, was the going to see the lying in state, but going to see the procession for the lying in state before. And so I had travelled down early that morning. I was actually being filmed for local TV, traveling down to so they saw me leaving the house and getting on the train and following, you know, all of that. And then of course we were sat there for hours waiting for something to happen. But it was at 2:22 that the procession left Buckingham Palace to go to Westminster Hall. And of course, we saw the king and his siblings marching behind the coffin, and the Prince of Wales and Duke of Sussex, and you know her other grandchildren, and the Duke of Gloucester, and other relatives. But I think the thing that struck me more than anything else was that, you know, the moment that, because until that point people had been sort of friendly and chatting away in quite hushed and respectful tones, but even so, chatting away. You know, as soon as the cortege left the palace, there was complete silence in the Mall, and you could only hear the gun salutes and the marching of the horses' hooves, and that really struck me. It was the, you know, the complete silence and the complete, you know, that sort of sense of attention, and that respectful quality of it, that did really strike me. But I'll tell you what I thought was really poignant about that more than anything else was seeing the imperial state crown on top of the coffin. And the reason I say that is because I had been a few times towards the end of the Queen's reign standing in the Mall to watch the procession for the state opening of Parliament. So anyone who's seen the procession for the state opening of Parliament will know that the imperial state crown is carried in procession ahead of the monarch to parts of Westminster, and travels in Queen Alexandra's state coach, ahead of the monarch in what used to be the Irish state coach or the Australian state coach, and now it's usually the Diamond Jubilee state coach. And then because the Queen used to wear the George IV diadem in the procession, and then would change into the crown once she reached the Palace of Westminster in the robing room. And so seeing the coffin being taken, and the crown on the coffin being taken on that same route that you had seen being taken so many times during her life, for it to be worn for the ceremony of the stating up of Parliament, I think that was the thing that really struck me. But it was partly that, and also partly thinking the next time we see that, it will be on Charles's head at the coronation. So I think it was partly that too. But as I say, that was the thing that I found really very moving, seeing it being carried in you know, on the same processional route, but rather than it being there for reasons of state, being there for, you know, such a sad occasion, and of course then going back for the funeral the following week, because I had been in church on the Sunday morning, so I couldn't go earlier, and so I had booked in a hotel the night and thought, well, I'll go like I did at the Jubilee and go, you know, very early and be there for 4 in the morning or something. Well, when I got there on the Sunday afternoon, I looked and I thought there's no chance, because it was just so busy in the Mall already. Well, unless I stay here now, I'm not going to see anything. So I did. I went, and luckily I'd taken a camping chair with me. I didn't have a sleeping bag or anything, but I did have a thick coat, and so yeah, just sort of pitched up and stayed there. And again, there was, you know, sort of great sort of camaraderie in the crowd. The thing I do remember is that, you know, when the funeral was on, very much like at the coronation, we weren't able to see it, but they did broadcast the service on loudspeakers. So you were able to join in with the hymns and with the national anthem and things. But there was just so many people just openly weeping in the street, and I didn't expect that. I expected people would be moved. I just didn't expect so many people to be in such floods of tears. That was something that did surprise me.
Yes, I I can understand that. I think people were crying for lots of different reasons, and I'm I I'm one of those people that I don't cry very much about things in my own life, but I do cry a fair amount about at films or books or things like that. So I'm not adverse to tears by any means, but I have always had a strong sense that when you admire any public figure, which you can absolutely do, you do have admiration for them, you do have respect for them. I think you can even have a form of love for them, but you don't know them. And I think it's I think that must always be remembered. And they don't offer you knowledge of them in that sense. It's not it's not on offer. And I think it always worries me slightly, and I think we saw this a lot with the death of the late Princess of Wales. You might be too young to actually remember, but
Not that
I'm
young.
not.
I was how old was I? 12 at the time.
I was 15, 14, 15, 15.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think the nervousness I have about these sorts of things is that I don't actually think it's for us as strangers to appropriate the grief of, say, a family member. And that's why I was slightly uncomfortable with some of the language around the Queen's death of, oh, it's like losing my own grandmother, which I understand. And in a sense, I see that she was the mother of the nation, the grandmother of the nation. But actually, I don't think that's what it is. I think there was grief, but I think most of the grief was really grief for what she represented in our national story, that she no longer could, because she's not with us anymore. And that certainty, that constancy, that continuity, in which she very much herself believed herself to be a figure, and the monarchy as well to be a figure of continuity. And that was gone, and that was strange, and that was a moment. But actually, one of the times I did get emotional in the funeral was I'd recently written, I'd not long at that point finished my a biography I'd written of Prince Arthur Tudor, who dies young and has a funeral, which is well documented. And I had found writing about that in quite vivid detail, because we have quite vivid detail, quite powerful. And I felt when watching the Queen's funeral, because so many of the aspects have remained from historical royal funerals. You and I know they actually haven't remained as much as they were reinvented about 100 years ago and revived in order to create a more mystique around royal ceremony. But nevertheless, I think the breaking of the rod or the staff of service,
Yes.
which I'd written about with Prince Arthur, which I found quite emotional, because people started weeping when that was, and that's what, to any great lord or prince or monarch, that was the official symbol that they their reign or their office was no more, that everyone was no longer bound to them, that their staff were effectively dismissed. They were now unemployed. That happened at the breaking of that staff, and then it was thrown into the ground with them. And when that happened, and I didn't know that was going to happen that I found very evocative and very moving.
And well done for getting in a mention of your book, Arthur Prince of Wales, Henry VIII's Lost Brother, which is available for people to order now.
I wasn't intentional, actually. It did just Arthur. There is no part of life that Arthur can't touch.
How very convenient. But what I would say, no, but I think you're right. But I think as well, it's for different reasons, isn't it? Because I think, as well as the loss of somebody who had meant a lot to a lot of people, it was knowing that was the end of an era, that things are going to change. And I don't think that as not just as a nation, but as people, we don't necessarily deal with change terribly well. We are afraid of change. And I think that part of it is that sense of stepping into the unknown, even though the current king had been Prince of Wales for such a long time, we knew a lot about him and his character, then it was still a seismic change, and something that that we'd not seen before. And so I think that was also part of it.
I think it was, and the irony, I suppose, of the Queen, of the late Queen, being the symbol of constancy and continuity, was that she presided over an era of such rapid change. And in terms of how visual and demonstrative and obvious that change was, I would say that era was probably more or less unprecedented
Hmm.
in British history. I appreciate Victoria's reign would also have felt
Oh, do
very
you know, I was
different
just going
beginning
to
to the
say,
end, but
I was saying that about as a child asking my dad about the death of George VI.
mm,
One other thing I remember asking him was also, do you think that this, the reign of Elizabeth II saw as much change as in
mm.
political, social, inventions, things like that, as Queen Victoria's reign? And wanted that sort of debate with him. Again, I was obviously that sort of royal geeky child, but
Yeah.
but I do remember asking that and thinking, and again,
What did
because
he say?
what did he say? I think he said that well, obviously not now, at the time, the current Queen's reign was probably the one because there had been sort of greater technological changes um, over that period, and sort of greater social changes than there were during Queen
Mm.
Victoria's reign. I think there were a lot of both in Queen Victoria's reign, but I think he was probably right. I think that when you look at Britain now compared to 1952, I think that the scale of change is probably more than between
Mm.
1837, sorry, and 1901. I
I
possibly.
mean, it is hard to quantify, isn't it? In that they were both,
Well, it depends what you count as,
yeah.
forever.
I mean, if in the beginning of Queen Victoria's reign, you know, the men of high office were wearing tights and wigs still, whereas I think that's fair to say. Whereas at the end of Victoria's reign, men were going outside to a phone box and making phone calls.
That's true.
That is huge. But then, if you look at Elizabeth II's reign, we've not to say we in the UK, but we as humanity have put men on the moon.
As a historian and as a history writer, how do you think that history will remember her?
Oh, undoubtedly is one of the most successful monarchs of all time. I mean, quantifying success among monarchs is very difficult historically because the essay question for William the Conqueror was infinitely different to the essay question for Elizabeth II. But if you were to distill it down to who fulfilled their brief most successfully, it's difficult to have anyone that did it better than Elizabeth II. And a cynic might say, well, what did she have to do? Monarchs don't have the high stakes that they used to. And I say, well, the fact that monarchy survives at all in 2023 is pretty remarkable. The fact it
I think I
survives,
think I
go
think if
on.
you got it wrong, you would
Yeah,
soon know about it.
I think so. I mean, the fact that it survives with as much popular support as it does is almost certainly a direct result of the efforts, endeavors, and skills of Elizabeth Alexandra Mary.
Hmm,
That's
indeed.
which was
And
the Queen.
just to bring it back to that address on her 21st birthday, my
Mm,
whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service. And
mm,
indeed it was. There was she had that public service almost running through her veins,
mm,
I would
mm,
say.
mm,
And you touched on it earlier. 2 days before she died, she received Liz Truss as Prime Minister at Balmoral. And
mm,
only the day before she died, she was approving the appointment of junior ministers in her cabinet.
mm,
And it was only, I think, the time that we knew that there was something a bit amiss was that she was too unwell to join the virtual Privy Council meeting that evening, and that
mm,
it was
mm.
postponed. And so, when you think that only the day before she died, she was still at her
Yeah,
desk,
yeah.
she was still working. Um, so I remember saying this on the radio at the time, and I stand by it now. The thing that I took great comfort from was that she died as she lived,
Mm,
as
mm,
as a
mm.
queen, and she was still working as queen. And I think that I mean, obviously, I didn't know her personally, but I would have thought that if she'd had a long period of inactivity where she hadn't been able to do that, I
Mm.
think that would have been the biggest sadness for her,
I agree.
because she had carried on, into her 90s, carried on during, even after losing Prince Philip, she was at the state opening of Parliament only a few weeks later.
Mm,
It meant a lot to her that she should carry on doing that. And despite increasing frailty, she carried on doing as much as she could. And so I think that for me was that thing that it embodied that level of service, that she had made that promise and she never deviated from it. And so
I completely agree.
I think that, and yes, you know, I do, without wanting to sound a complete sycophant, because I do appreciate that the role of monarchy has changed, and it may only have been reading state papers and signing them and turning up at events and waving at people and whatever, but all of those things she did well. You know, you couldn't criticize the way in which she was devoted to that. And I think that what was very telling is that I do actually number among my friends a lot of people who are either not fans of the royal family or are indifferent to them. Not one of them, and you know, they wouldn't hold back just because they knew that I was you know, great supporter of hers. Not one of them said anything that was critical of her as a person. None of them would criticize the way in which she devoted herself to her duties. And I think that was very telling. And I don't think it was just because people were afraid to say the wrong thing. I think that there was, you know, even people who are not supporters of the royal family, I think, were hard pressed to say something that they didn't admire the effort to which she had fulfilled her duties.
I think that is true. I think there was a sense among the Republican movement, I'm not talking about individuals with views, but the organized Republican movement, that they needed to play that very, very carefully, because any public support they might be able to build up could be crushed quite quickly if they got that wrong. But I agree. She gave a pretty faultless performance that it's quite hard, whatever your view on the institution of monarchy, it's pretty hard not to applaud the way that she did her job. And I thought what was also interesting was, because I have, you know, a background in media and I am very cognizant of what's on, how people are reacting to what's on, I did think the fact that even when we were sort of 6, 7, 8, 9 days into after Her Majesty's death and into the new reign, it was still dominating pretty much all the broadcast coverage across the TV, radio, news, and non-news. People would start getting restless about that, but actually people didn't. Now, of course, that's partly because these days, what does it matter what's on the BBC? You go and you watch your Netflix or whatever, so people are less bound to it. But I think in previous similar occasions, be like, yeah, all right, we've had enough now. Can we just get back to normal life? And I didn't sense much of that.
No, but we did get that only the year before with Prince Philip's death.
Yes,
there were people complaining, and you know, the media landscape had not changed within that 18 months. People were then complaining, oh, why is it on BBC One and BBC Two? Oh, why is it, you know, when they could easily watch a streaming service elsewhere. But there didn't seem to be those same sorts of complaints at this time. But you know, just looking again at her life, you know, after declaring that she would devote herself to duty, she did then come to the throne not long afterwards, because of course her father died when she was only 25, and of course she was a young wife, had 2 small children, and you can't, I think, underestimate what a real change that was to her personal life and her circumstances, because she'd had a degree of privacy, a degree of, you know, being able to be a young mother and also, you know, a young naval wife, living in Malta for part of the time. And then after that, and the one thing that I always struck me was, you know, when you saw those newsreel pictures of her descending the steps of the plane after returning home from Kenya, where she was on tour, that when I'd seen Lady Pamela Hicks interviewed, because of course she went as even though she was Prince Philip's cousin, was a lady in waiting.
Yes,
the tour,
cousin of Prince Philip's.
Yes, and had looked and said, "Oh, look, they've sent the hearses," meaning that they'd sent the big royal Rolls Royces rather than her own car, which was in Edinburgh Green. And so, you know, that was that. I think that was for her that moment that she saw, oh, it's always going to be like this.
Yes,
you know, that was the change for her.
I
It was
think
a moment of realization.
yes, I think that's right, and I thought it was very interesting that when the current Prince of Wales, when he was Duke of Cambridge, when he was first married and first had a young family, was quite jealously guarded the fact he was going to have about 5 years where they prioritized their family life, and him having a degree of normalcy with a job as a non-full-time working royal, which got them a lot of criticism.
Yes,
Um,
a lot of Christmas, work shy Willie, and
yeah, it all exactly, and but he was doing it because he knew that a day would come, and that day has now already come because he's Prince of Wales and the direct heir to the throne, where this will be his life, and that's that. But Elizabeth II never really had that window. I mean, as you said, she maybe had 2 or 3 years after
even
marriage,
so, she was still
but
heiress presumptive at the time, and her father was
she
still pretty
was.
ill. So, because George VI had a serious operation in 1948, only just after the current king was born. Sorry, shortly before, and so therefore, she'd had to act as a councillor of state on several occasions,
Yes.
or she'd had to stand in for her father at ceremonies. So if you look in the year before she became queen, not only did she take the salute at Trooping the Colour on his behalf, but she also received the state visit only a few weeks later. And so she was having to, step up and, read his speech at the state banquet and act as the hostess for that. And so, you saw that her, that it was coming to, she was having to take on more of the responsibilities even before then. The few years before she became queen. Of course, she had 2 young children. Of course, not there was quite a gap between the Princess Royal and the Duke of York, but then she went on to have 2 children, and was, of course, the 2 more children, was the first monarch since Queen Victoria to have a child while she was on the throne. And so again, that must have been difficult for her to be able to balance those responsibilities of a young family, and also all of the great responsibilities of state.
Huge, and it's very interesting to how public attitudes um change as well, because I can't remember whether the Queen would have been pregnant with Andrew or Edward at this point. When was the Duke of Edinburgh born? Do you remember? Was he
1964? Because that was
1964?
the year
Yes. So,
that there were 4 royal births, because James Ogilvy was born, Lady Helen Taylor, and Lady Sarah Chatto. They were all born within a few months of each other. And so people were having bets on, whether they'd be boys or girls and who'd be first, and all of that sort of thing, because they didn't announce in those days, who would be, who was, how far along they were.
yes.
So they just withdrew from engagements at a certain point.
I remember once watching some old news footage, which must have been on a documentary or YouTube, I don't know which, from 1964, when they were sort of doing vox pops, I guess, I don't think they called them vox pops then, of the general election of 1964. And they were asking, because there was Alec Douglas-Home, who was the Conservative Prime Minister, was up against not Ted Heath, Harold Wilson,
yes,
Labour. And there was a man, they were interested, what are you going to vote in the general election? And he said, well, I'm not very happy with the current government, but I'm going to vote Conservative. And they said, well, why are you going to vote for them if you're not happy? He said, well, I just think with the Queen at the moment, in her condition, or whatever phrase he would have used, it's not fair to force a change of government on her. She's got more than enough going on at the moment. I thought that's a very different, respectful attitude, but it's interesting that perhaps in a sense the country were minded of the unusualness of having a pregnant sovereign.
But of course, we did see a different side of the royal family with the royal family documentary in 1969, which of course I'm too young to remember, but having seen it in clips. But it is now, it did leak onto YouTube a few years ago.
Have you seen it all the way through then? Because I never have.
Yes, it did leak onto YouTube, and I think it was taken down, but then appeared back and things like that. But you saw a very different side of her, and yes, some of it probably was staged, in terms of going into the shop at Sandringham to buy ice lollies for Prince Edward.
I've seen that clip, yeah.
But even so, I think the thing that you didn't wouldn't have known before. And actually, I will say that, you know, during COVID,
Mm,
because a lot of her engagements were virtual, so you actually saw her interacting with people far more than,
mm.
because, you know, if you saw her being filmed, you know, and she was going and meeting people in a line, you might have just overheard a snippet of the conversation and you
Yes,
didn't really
yes,
get the
yeah.
humour. And I think that when that royal family documentary was broadcast was the first time that people had heard her speaking conversationally, either
Mm,
with
mm,
her family, with the prime minister, with other
mm.
government ministers, with ambassadors, you know, because her style of speech, as it would be for you or me or anyone else, would be very different from if you were standing and making a public,
Yes.
you know, when she was opening Parliament or when she was doing her Christmas broadcast, would be when people had normally heard her. So I think to be able to hear her in
Mm.
conversation with other people, I think would have been something that was quite a pleasant surprise, that she, you know, that she did actually sound, that was very relatable, you know, that they sort of laughed at a lot of the same things that you or I might, or that, you know,
And
they
just that they
discussed.
do things like they go into a shop and they pay for stuff. I mean, I remember I've still got friends who've said, obviously, they're not the generation that would have seen the 69 documentary, but would still say things like, oh, did you know the Queen doesn't know how to use money? And apparently there's some clip where once someone gave her some money and she didn't know what it was. And I'm like, oh, I don't know where this mystical clip, I've never seen it. It's never seems to have surfaced anywhere. But, just that program just would just pay to all those sorts of stories. And of course, the Queen knows how to go to a shop and buy her son an ice cream or whatever it was.
Well, she was taken to shops as a child, and so,
Yes.
you know, they would go and spend, you know, use their spending money like other children would, although for them it'd be far more of a novelty than it would be for other people. But, you know, I
Yeah.
think that the idea that she was completely guarded and would have no idea, I think is over-egged in the
Oh,
media.
yes, I think so. I mean, and I think that's what and then some people, of course, were always critical of that documentary, saying, well, that begun the demystification of monarchy
Or
and it
let,
led
as
to the
in
press
Badgett's
intrusion that
words, let too
followed.
much light in on the magic, daylight in on the magic.
Yes, but I don't agree. I mean, I think you do have to keep things moving slowly forward. You just do it in a way that's mindful and careful and holds true to the values that you're trying to preserve. But I think a degree of, and this was the 60s for crying out loud, a degree of lifting the veil was necessary.
Mm, mm. I'll tell you one thing that did sort of really strike me was that, you know, she always said that she had to be seen to be believed,
Yes.
that she was always, I think, mindful of the threat to her, but she never let it overwhelm her. She was still appearing in public. And so, you know, if you look in 1981, only a few
Mm,
weeks before Charles and Diana were married,
mm,
she was
mm.
shot at Truth in the Colour. And
Yes,
she didn't,
yes.
you know, she was not to know that they were blanks that were
No,
being
of course
shot.
she wasn't. No.
But, you know, when you look at that back, and indeed, there was a documentary a few years ago where you saw the Duke of Kent, who was riding behind her
Mm.
on that day, seeing that footage, and you know, whether he'd seen it back before, but certainly commenting on it. And you cannot fail to see how she kept that horse under control and simply carried on. And the only casualty was that she lost the garter star from her
Oh,
uniform. Because, you know, if you see pictures, then she was just wearing the sash and no star.
yeah,
But I think
yeah.
it was retrieved for the, you know, in time for the balcony appearance. But you know, to take nothing away from the fact that she showed real grace under fire.
Mm, mm, mm. I think she probably had, and I'm speculating because obviously I've never had this conversation with her, or indeed ever had any conversation with her, but I think there was huge threat to the Queen of all the royal family and what they do, because the truth is you can only make things so secure and so safe and have lots of people approach you. You do have to make a degree of choice between those two things, which isn't say that the security teams don't do an excellent job of keeping them as safe as possible. So I think for the Queen's logic would simply have been, well, if I go and someone shoots at me and I'm dead, that's not great. But if as a result I stay behind closed doors and don't go out and do my job, I may as well be dead. So, there's no point in not taking that risk, which is incredibly courageous.
Um, I'll tell you what. Also, I do remember. Uh, that I do remember from life was, you know, you remember the Windsor Castle Fire,
I do. 92.
1992. That was actually on my 8th birthday.
Oh, right.
It was because and of course it was the Queen's wedding anniversary as well, her 45th wedding anniversary. But I remember coming home from school and watching the Windsor Castle in flames, but also seeing her just watching that. And of course, it was only a few weeks after that she made that famous Anna's Horribilis speech.
1992 is not a year I will look back on with undiluted pleasure. It has been, in the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, an Annus Horribilis.
Do you know who that sympathetic correspondent was?
I've seen him interviewed, but I can't recall his name now.
It was Sir Edward Ford, who had been her assistant private secretary.
Right.
During her reign. I think that was his words rather than the Queen's.
Well, it was, but apparently I've heard him say he got the Latin grammar on that a bit wrong.
Yes.
And it shouldn't be quite. Is that true? Have you heard that?
Yes, I have. I couldn't tell you what it was because I never studied Latin at school, but
no,
yeah,
we're not of that generation, are we?
No, my dad did because he went to grammar school, in the 50s, but no, sadly not. But if you think as well that I think that looking, because I've seen that speech in full recently rather than just the that short extract, and it's all the more poignant for the fact that she had a very sore throat, partly because of the Windsor Castle fire and partly because she had a bad cold, but also I think that the way in which it was said with a real sort of sense of humility, and that I think when people say that the Queen has never complained, never explained, they've never seen that speech, I would say.
I know. I mean, and because she really dresses head on, doesn't she, with the whole no institution, city, monarchy, whatever, can expect to be free from the scrutiny of those that give it their support, not to mention those who don't. Yes. So that's quite loaded. And it was her.
And of course, you mentioned city because it was
just the Lord Mayor's Corporation of London. Yeah, absolutely. So no, I agree. And that, I think, is what we have seen so much in her reign, which is this constant, a sort of never complain, never explain, except, and this is such a rare gift, just knowing the one or two moments where you deviate from that tried and tested mantra.
Well, I think that it's, when we were talking about the coronation, we were looking at ceremonies and how they're invented. And we talked about George V and Queen Mary. I think it's very telling that she was their granddaughter and that she'd seen the success that they had with reinventing the monarchy after the First World War.
Yes.
And with the ceremonies of the Jubilee and all of those things. And I think that they, for all that George V and Queen Mary were seen, was commented on that it was an alien and uninspiring court. They actually had people to tell them, had a very good idea of the popular mood. And I think that, again, she had that. She was able to say, and I think what was very telling, and one of the lesser reported parts of that Annus Horribilis speech was when she talked about the bishop who was talking to Queen Victoria about praying for the royal family. And he said that no one can pray too heartily. And that Queen Victoria had replied to him and said, no, not too heartily, but too often. And so I think that was her way of saying that there'd been too much of coverage of the royal family, and that they needed to take a step, not the royal family, but everyone needed to take a step back and view things with more perspective rather than the sort of hysteria that was facing them at that point. And of course, again, only 5 years later, and just after the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, there was, of course, their golden wedding. And one of the most, I think, moving things she ever said was when she talked about Prince Philip, when she said that he doesn't take kindly to compliments, but quite simply he was a strength and stay.
Yes.
And that she and his family and the whole country owed him a debt greater than he would claim and we should ever know. And I think that was so moving that she would have said all of that in public to her husband. In front of so many people. And so again, when people say that she was cold-hearted and didn't show emotion, again, I don't think they've seen that. I don't think that they've seen the real depth of emotion that she was able to convey in just those few words. Although it was not said in a real sort of romantic and schmaltzy way.
Well, what do people expect? It's just burst into song or something. I mean,
that emotion was clearly there.
Very much. Yeah. I mean, there is real dignity in restrained affection. I think the fact that the role, her station in life, probably her personality, and certainly her generation would not encourage her to share that sort of emotion as demonstrably as perhaps people born when we were born or younger. But the fact she still chose to do it, knowing that it doesn't come so naturally, makes it, I think, far more meaningful, impactful, and emotional.
Indeed, indeed. And I think that, and it was funny because Prince Philip had spoken about her only the day before, and again was not quite as emotional, but certainly showed his great affection for her as well. And I think
Yes.
that, when you saw them together, you could see. I always got the impression, and I mean, I only saw them together as an elderly couple, but you
Mm,
sort of got the impression that they were sort of egging each other on,
mm,
to take
mm,
enjoyment from things, and that they were sort of spurring each other on to go there and to take as much enjoyment from everything as they can, and to carry on doing that
mm,
duty, that
mm,
they were in
mm.
it together, and they did seem a real partnership. And I think that was evident whenever you saw them. And I think as well that they both had the sort of sense of humor, that they would both notice things in the
Mm,
crowd, and that they would, as soon as they were driving off in the car, they'd be talking about what they'd seen and who they'd seen, and all
mm,
of that
mm,
sort of thing. And
mm,
I think that they were just such a great team, really.
mm.
I think one of the things sort of in our living memory that was a real stand-up moment was that historic state visit to the Republic of Ireland,
Mm,
11.
mm.
I think that was a real triumph for diplomacy. I think that
Yes. Yeah.
for me was a real sort of stand-up moment of her reign.
Mm,
Watching that on television, watching her go and lay the wreath at the site
mm,
of the Easter Rising, and at the state banquet, and speaking in Gaelic,
mm.
all of those things. I think it was more than just a calculated PR stunt. I think that there was genuine feeling and genuine affection there,
I
and
think so.
also that there was a sense of danger to that, because there had been protests planned ahead, and whatever. But as soon as she'd arrived, the mood did seem, although admittedly, only from a distance, did seem to change. And I think that was, again, said a lot for her
Mm,
character, that she should do that. And also, one mustn't forget that Lord Mountbatten had been killed
mm.
in the Republic of Ireland in 1979, and so it was, I think, a very significant moment.
It was a
For her.
significant moment which a lot of people younger than us won't, as they look back and understand why it was so significant. Now, I suspect that our content does not necessarily have a lot of Gen Z listeners.
I don't know. I'm sure that we are down with the kids, but
Yeah, I mean, I know we do funky raps and stuff to bring in. We don't, by the way. Disclaimer, that's not
we
true.
might.
If you are a younger Gen Z, I'm not sure how we're saying it. Listener, you are very, very welcome. We love having you as part of our community, but I suspect that's not our defining demographic. But what I find interesting, because I'm quite involved in lots of things, but I'm quite involved in local politics where I live. And when I speak to people who are involved in politics, so politically literate, who are 20 years younger than me, so in very young adulthood, they don't really
Well,
understand.
you're still in young adulthood yourself.
I'm what did we decide we were? We were late
Well,
youth.
no, we did. No, I'll tell you what. We decided that you were in early middle age,
Did
and that I
we?
was, yes, and that I was still in late youth, because I've not yet got to that birthday with a naught on the end. So I'm
Oh,
still
I think
pushing. I'm pushing the
I'm not
envelope.
sure. I'm not sure we decided that I was in a different age bracket to you, but you may have decided that. Anyway, but these very young adults or people who are 21, 22, and they don't understand the significance of Northern Ireland, because when we were growing up, it was on the news every day.
It
The
was,
Troubles
and
were on the news every day.
and I mean, I'm old enough to remember and not really understand the significance of it, but seeing bombings in London, in Manchester, and of course in Northern Ireland itself, and and knowing about, and of course there was the whole thing, wasn't there, that when Jerry Adams was on the news, that his voice had to be
His
dubbed
voice
by an
and his
actor.
face was fuzzed
Yes,
out. Yeah.
but yet there was no censorship of what he was saying,
Because
but
the
just
media outlets deliberately chose to misunderstand the law.
yes, of
Basically, the
course.
idea was that his voice would be silenced. That was the law. So you
Mm,
can
mm.
broadcast his voice, meaning don't show him. But they just used the words and changed the voice. So
Yes,
it was a
yes,
deliberate misunderstanding
yes.
of the law.
No, I understand that, but what I'm saying is that it did seem to make a bit of a mockery of it. But of
Well,
course,
that they were trying to make a
yes.
mockery of it.
But my point essentially is that you and I still, even though we'd have been children at the time, we're still old enough to remember that being very
Yes,
current in the
absolutely.
news. And so I think that people who are younger wouldn't necessarily understand the significance of
Well, they
that state
wouldn't.
visit
I
because
remember.
that would never have happened 10 years before.
No, and I remember growing up, people were genuinely quite scared about the idea of going to London. It's like, oh, I might get bombed. Do I go to London? Or even Bristol, people. I mean, and you weren't going to get bombed in Bristol, but
Yeah.
um, and don't get, I'm not suggesting that the troubles in Northern Ireland directly affected people like you and I on the mainland in anything
No,
like the way that they
no,
affected people in Northern Ireland. The only point I'm making is that because it was saturating news coverage for a decade, we're
yes.
very mindful of why the Queen's visit to the Republic of Ireland at their invitation and being such a success is significant in a way I suspect younger people who are maybe interested in the monarchy won't necessarily have the same instinctive sense of now.
No, and I must just say, and I know that this will be very, very, very predictable of me, but the diplomacy in her dress and in her jewels and everything,
Mm,
and so of course she did wear the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara
mm,
at the state banquet, and instead of wearing an order, because I think if she had, because obviously she didn't have an Irish order. And so if she'd won the
yes,
Garter, it may have been seen as sort of English supremacy or British supremacy. So instead
exactly.
of
It would
wearing the
absolutely have been.
no,
Yeah.
so instead of wearing the Garter, she had that harp of crystals that was sewn into the
Mm,
dress. I think again that just captured that
mm,
that mood perfectly. It was real, I think, um, lesson in
mm,
diplomatic
mm, mm,
dressing in the same way that her mother had in 1938 when she'd gone to Paris and the White
mm.
Wardrobe for different reasons. But again, I think it was really very significant. And I know that it sounds very flippant talking about the dress and the jewels and everything, but I think when you look at that look for that state banquet, it speaks volumes.
I don't think it's flippant at all. I think it's very powerful, and I think it's something she's often perfected. And of course, she was also seen after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. She was seen wearing the Ukrainian colours as
Mm.
well, and I think it's a very powerful way of making an intervention. The Queen knowing that she's not there to speak into any great depth to the geopolitical situations that she finds herself in, but her few interventions into the worlds of politics have been timely and I think generally welcome and helpful.
And
And there was a few.
there were a few. There were a few. Um, of course, again, one great momentous occasion, but one which she was very keen to downplay, was 2015 when she became the longest reigning monarch. And
Yes.
and you can understand why,
Yes, so
because
you
for
can. You really
her,
can. Yeah.
yeah, because I think that because George VI died so long before, people almost not forgot him, but would forget that he was her father rather
Yes.
than
Yes.
the previous king. And
Yeah.
so, of course, she only became the longest reigning monarch because she'd lost her father so young.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. Yes. Whereas for someone like Queen Victoria, who I'm not saying Queen Victoria wanted to play it up because I think the limited documentary evidence suggests she didn't particularly either, but she'd come to the throne as the result of a death of a relatively not elderly, but by the standards of the
Well,
day.
I mean, William IV was over 17, although
Yeah.
although yes, she'd been prevented from attending court because she did have a genuine affection for her
Yes.
uncle.
An
Um,
affectionate elderly uncle is different to your
father.
prematurely,
Yeah.
your father who dies far too early, who is the apple of your eye and you're the apple of his eye, and you absolutely dote on each other. It's not a comparable situation, is it?
No, it's not. But the way in which she addressed that, because she did was during the Balmoral break, but she was tempted out to go and open the Borders Railway, and so she did make a public speech. I don't think I would guess she didn't particularly want to do that and draw
Mm,
attention to it, but she did, and she did, of course, mention that it was an honour to which she had never aspired. So you could, you could sense that in her, but of course her sense of duty meant that she carried on, and she did that. We must also remember the way in which those 2 addresses that she gave to the nation in 2020 did really, there was the first one addressing COVID specifically, saying that we will meet again. But then, of course, a few weeks later, it was the anniversary of VE Day, 75th anniversary of VE Day, and because of the restrictions, that meant there were no public occasions, and so that's why she gave an address to the nation then. And again, it just, because she had that photograph of her father on the desk, and she was saying that she was speaking, at the same time that he had 75 years before, and I think you were struck by the fact that yes, she was an elderly lady, but she was that link to that earlier age, and so I think
absolutely. I think all the significant events around the ending of World War II from the 90s onwards, which is when I suppose we were starting to celebrate 50 years of all those things, were all significant, because at the time you had the Queen, you had the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret, who were symbols during World War II, and who could be with us in the commemoration. So I think she always understood her role, not just as a philosophical connection, which monarchy always is. Monarchy is always our connection to the past, but it's a very real, personal, tangible connection.
And I mean, from my point of view, having seen her and been to several occasions, there are a couple that really stand out. And the first thing I would say is that whenever you saw her in person, there were 3 things that you were really struck by. The first was how short she was. I mean, she was never tall, but obviously as she got older, she was, as a lot of people do, would shrink. And so it was this small figure, but yet still a commanding presence. And I think that's because you've seen somebody so often on the television or pictures that when they're actually in front of you and they, they're animate and they move, it's something very special. But also, I think as well that the luminosity of her skin, she had flawless complexion. And again, you'll say this is very typical for me to say this, but the jewelry, because you generally see her outside, and so therefore she'd be wearing a brooch and glisten in the sunlight, and so that would again really strike you. But I tell you, a couple of things that I do really remember is that I was fortunate enough to go to the Order of the Thistle service at St Giles, Edinburgh, a couple of times when the Queen was alive and was still there, and seeing her walk in the procession, and the Princess Royal was just ahead of her. Now, we often think about the Princess Royal being more like Prince Philip, and certainly the way in which she stands with her hands behind her back and everything. She looks a lot like her father. In her facial features, she's the image of her mother, and so seeing them together, that really struck me, and that's always stayed with me. So now whenever I see the Princess Royal, I do see that resemblance in her. But I must say that the one that I do remember most was her 90th birthday at Windsor, because she again hadn't wanted to make a big public celebration, because there would be Trooping the Colour a few months later, which I went to that. But seeing her carry out a short walkabout from Windsor Castle to the Guildhall, so we saw her talking to people, accepting flowers. And one thing I always remember, which is not about the Queen, but the occasion I'll never forget, there were these 2 ladies there, and they were Welsh, and they were dressed as though they were going to Royal Ascot, and they had a pushchair, and I assumed that it was the grandchild of one of them, because they were too old for it to be their child. It was the dog that was in the pushchair, dressed up, but they had these balloons, a 9 and a 0 for 90. Well, the 9 blew away, and so this woman was completely inconsolable and just in the middle of the street. And so all the press photographers were taking a picture, and it was in the newspapers the next day. Well, anyway, they did then manage to get another 9, well, they couldn't get another 9 on its own actually, so they could only get another 90. So they briefly had 900, and I said to the person I was with, I said, they do know she's not 900, don't they? But anyway, we saw her. But
Yeah.
and then they came back from the Guildhall in what was officially known as the State Review vehicle, but was known as the Queen Mobile. And so
Right.
standing up in the back of what was a converted Range Rover and waved. And the thing that was really funny is that, as they went past, I'd got my camera back. I didn't manage to get a really good photograph. And there was that split second of people starting to disperse as they went past. And I was thinking, do I stay here and be good to the fact that I didn't get a great, because I had got some photographs as they walked past, but didn't get a great photograph here? Or do I run down the side street and then try and get in front? Well, you can guess which I did, can't you? And so, then when I got home and was watching the coverage back, you could see me running ahead, trying to get a photograph, and then running ahead a bit more, trying to get another photograph. And it paid off because I managed to get a good photograph. What was funny is I was with June, a lady I know, and she was in her 70s at the time, and so there were these two ladies who they assumed that she was my grandma, but they also assumed that I'd just gone and left her. She knew I was coming back, but
yeah,
that was quite funny. But that was very special. And I was at Windsor again 3 years later because her birthday happened to fall on Easter Day, and so you can see members of the royal family go to St George's Chapel, and she came out of the chapel, and for me again that was just one of those, and I managed to get a photograph of her because we sang Happy Birthday. She came out the chapel, and again it was, for me, that just encapsulates everything that you know about her. Just in the background there, and you can see it because it had everything there, because it had the hat, the gloves, the pearls, the flowers. If you were to describe her, it was all of those individual components that you would see, that you'd see there. But I must say that the thing that for me was most special was being there on that. I know I've spoken about this before, was there on the day of that last balcony appearance at the Platinum Jubilee, because I was with my friend Dina, because I only met him a couple of days before actually, because we met at the service at St Paul's Cathedral, because we've both been outside there for hours and swapped, and he said he was going to watch the pageant, and because he was going on his own. I was going, I said, oh, do you want to meet him? Well, we both watched it and did. And because the Queen had missed several of the occasions for the Jubilee, she hadn't been well enough to go to St Paul's for the Thanksgiving service, and she hadn't been well enough to go to the Derby. And I think both of those were significant, because we all know how she took her role as the Supreme Governor of the Church of England very seriously, and was a great churchgoer. And so I think that the fact she wasn't able to go to the Thanksgiving service would have been a big deal for her. And again, we all know how much she loved her horse racing, and so to miss the Derby again, I think would have been significant. So we weren't expecting to see her at the pageant. Indeed, she wasn't in the royal box. But then there was a rumor that she might attend. And at that moment that the royal standard was raised over Buckingham Palace, it was that real moment of everything's all right now. It is as it should be. And of course, once the barriers opened, even though we'd not known each other very long, but of course we went sort of arm in arm because we didn't want to lose each other, and ran down, and just then being able to see her on the balcony, and I think we sensed, I think, that might be the last time. And I remember Dean saying, actually, the next time we see this might be the coronation, and indeed he was right, it was. But for that moment, just seeing her there and having that opportunity to sing God Save the Queen, it was one of the last times that we did sing God Save God Save the King, but just having that moment, I think, was just extremely special. And that's one of the things that I look back on, and I'm so grateful that I was able to be there for that moment, knowing that was the last time, it was the end of an era, and being able to share in a small way. I know I don't, please don't misrepresent me, because I do know that I was one of hundreds of thousands in a crowd. I don't mean that there's any kind of personal relationship, but just being able to be there and witness that,
and
I
being
part
of the moment, and part of that moment between a queen and her people, which, as you said, really was the last time that moment existed. And to be part of that is very special. And to share that reflection, I think is probably a good way for us to draw our conversation naturally to a close.
Indeed, indeed. Well, it's been lovely to have the opportunity to share those memories, and I hope that other people have been able to reflect and think of their own memories of Elizabeth II, because I'm sure that many people have them. And it's been lovely to have the chance to talk to you, and hopefully we'll be doing some more fairly soon.
I think we will. I think we will watch this space, Royal History Geeks, for more information on forthcoming content. Until then, take care of yourself, everybody, and I hope that you have a chance today to reflect on both the momentous occasion a year ago of the passing of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, and also the tremendous reign and 70 years of service, more than 70 years of service, that she devoted her life to.
Take care. Goodbye.